Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for being here. And it's my pleasure to pass the e-floor on to you.
Okay, my pleasure to be with you, young man. And I have been listening to your remarks, and I must say you speak very well and very impressively. You've given me the topic, the future of cross-border cooperation. And I wish I could give you an optimistic speech. I think young people deserve to look forward to the world into which they're growing up and which they will have to run. But I'm afraid that what I'm seeing in this COVID-19 era is, in fact, the beginning of an era of deglobalization. That is, the signs seem to be mounting that the world may embrace isolationism and protectionism in a far more enthusiastic way than prior to the outbreak, including in our own India. The indications are evident and understandable. The pandemic has confirmed for many that in terms of crisis, people rely on their governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable, and that dependence on foreign countries for essential goods, such as pharmaceuticals, or even the ingredients that go into making them, could be fatal. Nations tried aggressively to acquire medicines and supplies for their own people at the expense of each other at the start of the pandemic. There's been a rush to reset global supply chains and to raise trade barriers between nations. The demand for more protectionism and self-reliance, echoed in our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi's call for Atmanirbharta, the call for bringing manufacturing and production value chains back home, or at least closer to home, is actually mounting. Along with the global flow of capital and investments, multi-border pipelines, energy grids, even international travel across free and open borders, all seem to me to be rather vulnerable in the post-COVID era. I'll give you the example of Europe, which had essentially visa-free, restriction-free, checking-free travel throughout the Schengen zone. And that was one of the first casualties of COVID. They shut all their borders down. And in fact, they have begun largely to open them again. But I understand with a renewed threat of another wave of COVID coming, many of the border restrictions are back in place in Europe as well. So how do you talk about cross-border relationships in this COVID-dominated atmosphere? And if you look at the world economy, it had thrived since globalization began in 1980 on an open system of free trade. That had already been shaken by the financial crash of 2008-9 and the American trade war with China. With the coronavirus, it's much worse now. Exports are falling everywhere. Indications are that world goods trade may shrink by 30% this year, if not more. Meanwhile, the increasing pressure to decouple from China suggests another attack on globalization. Japan, for instance, has set aside $2.25 billion in incentives for Japanese companies who pull out of that country. And this means that the world is going to have to suddenly deal with, or without the more inexpensive Chinese labor and subsidized inputs of the globalized era. And if the era of cheap globalized goods may be over, the world economy will also start cracking apart. And then there's the political consequence. You have talked about cross-border relations. Well, COVID-19 has convinced many people in many countries that foreigners are to be feared, that strict border and immigration controls are essential, that countries cannot always expect useful help from their neighbors and allies, and therefore that national interests should trump international cooperation. I chose that verb advisedly. To many, including those around Mr. Modi, the answer lies in strong government, in putting the nation's needs over individual citizens' freedoms, and in dispensing with democratic niceties, from federalism to parliamentary oversight, in whatever the government deems to be the national interest. So those of us who had begun to imagine the globe as one world will have to revise our thinking. Support for nationalist strongmen, many of whom have used the present crisis to shore up their authority and power, may actually increase exponentially. Already, this pandemic period seems to have ushered in an increased fear of the other. Xenophobia is on the rise. unfounded rumors and accusations against people blamed on the basis of their national, religious, ethnic, or even regional identity have had a field day in many countries. Many of you have seen WhatsApp videos of say, Chinese-looking people being shouted at and even pushed out of Western supermarkets. But in India, citizens from our own northeastern states have suffered racial discrimination because of their supposedly Chinese features. Social media and nativist populism have amplified prejudices. You may all remember the fact that a Puritan Muslim sect, the Tablighi Jamaat, had held a major gathering just before the lockdown, whose attendees spread the infection to many states when they returned home, was used to justify open bigotry and discrimination against Muslims. The atmosphere created by the virus has empowered those who seek to spread another contagion, that of communal hatred and bigotry. And that too has affected cross-border relationships. Some of you may know that when the Islamophobia after the Tablighi Jamaat business grew, and it was noticed in Arab countries in the Gulf, there was a backlash from there saying that Indians should not forget that they're welcome in this country only as people who respect we of the Islamic world and work with us. How can you show Islamophobia at home and come and work in Islamic countries here? And that really, I think, shook up a lot of people, and some indeed lost their jobs in the UAE and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia because of the bigotry they'd expressed on social media. So that too affects cross-border relationships. Now, there is no doubt that the whole COVID-19 pandemic was a mega shock to the global system, and that it is likely to disrupt the existing world order. We are really worried because our sovereignties are reasserted across the world, and treaties and trade agreements are increasingly questioned. Multilateralism could be the next casualty. I spent, as you rightly said, 29 years of my life working for the United Nations. Now, President Trump has announced the withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization. He's already pulled America out of UNESCO. Israel, too, has done that. And the worry that comes up is, at a time when you have a pandemic that is itself crossing all borders, the one thing you always want is an international organization that can find international solutions for these problems. When I was at the United Nations in the era of Kofi Annan as Secretary General, we used to call them problems without passports. That is, problems that crossed all borders. Essentially, problems that were not confined to any one country and therefore couldn't be solved by any one country. Problems like the environment. You can't put a fence in the sky and fence off your climate. Problems like refugee movements, human rights issues, world trade issues. All of these and many, many others, drug abuse and drug trafficking. There's so many issues we can come up with, at least 20 of them, are genuinely problems without passports because they're not confined to any one place. And therefore they require international solutions, blueprints without borders, if you like. That's what was the justification for multilateralism. Now I fear multilateralism could be the next casualty because the international system so painstakingly constructed after World War II could unravel in the wake of what's happened to the US pulling out of WHO. If Mr. Trump is re-elected in November, might he turn his attention to the UN itself and say, why do we need it here? The US can get along perfectly well alone. In Europe, we've seen the British pull out of the European Union, Brexit. More and more countries are saying, we can go it alone. Our nationhood, our sovereignty is vital. So my concluding worry is that instead of strengthening the capacity of our global institutions to cope with a future crisis, the world's reaction to the virus may well end up destroying the most fundamental feature, the idea of our common humanity. I'll stop there and I'd be happy to take some questions on this theme over the next 10 minutes or so, Vivan, from your participants.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. I think that really sort of gave us an insight that was not only, complementary to what all these students were discussing, but also to what we've been thinking about global relations. So one of the questions that has come in from an advocate is, so the deglobalization phenomenon that you mentioned, is it temporary or is it something that will go on for a longer while than we think? And also, when do you think as a country, India will recover from the pandemic that has shaken all of us?
Well, I'm afraid that's both those questions require a crystal ball, and I kind of smashed one when I was working for the UN. But let me just say that as far as the first question is concerned, we hope it is temporary. Those of us who care about international cooperation, about multilateralism, I certainly would be a strong advocate of reinforcing multilateralism in a more equitable way where more countries work together. But at this stage, it depends. I mean, for example, if Mr. Trump loses the election, it's possible the US might reconsider its stance. I don't see Mr. Trump and his administration going back on their decision to pull out, which comes fully into effect in March. So that sort of thing worries me. So it is, I hope, temporary, but it could be much more enduring. On the question of India and COVID, your guess is as good as mine, because at the moment, and I have read extensively the works of experts on this, we haven't even hit peak yet. The more testing we do, the more numbers we're finding. And more spreading to the rural areas and small towns means that the numbers there have just begun to climb. It is hoped that, say, in places like Delhi and Mumbai, that in a couple of months we'll hit peak and then it'll start coming down. But in places like Jumri Talaya, you may well find the numbers climbing for the next 6 months. So we just don't know. And I don't think any epidemiologist, I mean, you hear, go on YouTube and the web and see 5 different assessments by 5 different epidemiologists, get 5 different answers, including about whether we're over-testing, under-testing, whether our fatality rate is unusually low or in fact conceals the fact that we haven't tested enough, why Pakistan has got very few infections and even lower numbers of fatalities per million population, whereas we have very many more, etc., etc. Just Google these things. There's plenty out there. So the answer is, I don't have an answer. No one has an answer. We'll have to live with it for a while yet, is my best guess. Certainly, I'm not expecting anything like the sort of pre-March normality in our lives, even by March of next year. So I think it's going to be at least a full year of the kind of privations we've gone through as things look right now. I certainly hope that changes for all our sakes.
Great. So our next question comes from Oishi Banerjee, and she asks, do you think the world is shifting towards local or regional blocs rather than global alliances?
It could happen, because it's no doubt that once the storm passes, we're all going to be inhabiting a different world. I mentioned international travel and everything else, social distancing norms may come up. I think we're also going to have to rethink how much we do through global institutions. And I am an advocate of multilateralism, but others like Mr. Trump are not. They may say, look, why don't we just strengthen, we strengthen, of course, our national sovereignties, but we can also strengthen our own backyards. The counter answer to Oishi is that even regional organizations may not do very well. We've seen the Brits pull out of Brexit. We saw the Europeans coming to a real crisis over the clash between the so-called frugal four, which are the rich northern European countries that wanted essentially to protect themselves initially, and the poorer countries in the southern part of Europe, including France and Spain, that said we need to have a bailout for all European countries that the rich Europeans will also cover the costs of. And it was a big controversy because when the frugal four said, sorry, you guys really have to look after your own thing. We're not going to be able to spend our money because you didn't protect yourself properly. There was a backlash from countries like France and Spain. This is like saying that our ship has hit an iceberg and you're arguing about different standards for the first class passengers and the economy. And it looked really bad, but the Europeans finally got their act together. And this month, or last month, August, they did agree on a mutually financed bailout. But I'm just saying that these are the kinds of strains that even regional organizations with a great successful track record are suffering. Because the EU was built on the premise that it would kind of be the globe's poster child for free movement of goods, services, capital, and people across the borders of sovereign countries. But when these 9 pandemic hit countries wanted help, with a joint Corona bond, and the Frugal Four said no, it suddenly meant that the whole concept of them, being the epitome of regional cooperation ceased to have any real meaning. European solidarity seemed not to exist. I don't know whether she's feeling that regional organizations would be the answer necessarily apply. My worry is it's going to be much more a sort of thinking of every country for itself, every man for himself, a much more sort of selfish, nationally centered approach. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I'd like to go back to the era of multilateral cooperation, because it seems to me that the very fact that the pandemic spread around the world actually, how can I put it bluntly, actually confirms the argument that we need more international cooperation, not less.
Yeah.
One final question, I'm afraid, or maybe two more if we can finish in 6:45.
Yeah,
Go
sure.
ahead, Viva. Yeah.
Sure. So the next one has sort of a humorous part to it as well. So the next question we have is also pretty central to CX, and that's how can youths play a role and start to get to the positions of leadership, and how can we sort of get to being those who can make a change? And another part of this question is, and how do we make our vocabulary as good as yours as we come?
The vocabulary part is easy to dispense with. Just read. I keep telling young people, ask me that question. The way I acquired my vocabulary is by reading widely and indiscriminately. Of course, unlike you guys, I didn't have Nintendo and computers and even television when I was growing up, and therefore, and mobile phones, of course, weren't even a gleam in an inventor's eye. So I had very few distractions, and books were my escape, my entertainment, my education. And therefore, I ended up essentially acquiring my vocabulary through extensive, wide, and sometimes rather indiscriminate reading. I would still recommend it. And I think that if you come across a word in 3 different books, in 3 different sentences, in 3 different contexts, you'll very quickly figure out the meaning, the usage, the nuance of its usage without actually even bothering to look up a dictionary. That's essentially the way I picked it up. But on the first question, I think there are 2 parts to it really also, which is that what can all of you do as young people, and what can we do as older people to make it possible for younger people to make an impact? Well, for you people, I would say that what you need to do is be interested, be involved, read up, take an interest in public affairs, take an interest in politics, take an interest in social questions, economic questions. And the better informed you are, the more seriously adults will take you. And as for the second part of that question, I do think that we, the older generation, have an obligation to lower some of the barriers and the hurdles that we have put in your way. Right now, for example, I've advocated, and I even introduced a private member's bill suggesting that we should reserve a certain number of seats in Parliament for people under 30, and that we should lower the eligibility age for standing for election from 25 to 18. If you're allowed to vote at 18, why shouldn't you be able to run for office at 18? We have in India today the largest gap in the world. We actually have the world record for the largest gap between the median age of the population and the median age of the cabinet. That has to change. We must have more young people empowered to speak for and take decisions for the young people who are the majority of this country. 50.1% of India is under 25, 65% are under 35. And yet we only have a handful of parliamentarians, let alone ministers, below 35 in our country. That really must change. And so you must be alert, active, engaged, and involved, and we must make it slightly more realistic for you to do that.
Great, thank you so much. Are you open to one more question? If you are,
I've hit my deadline, but since I see you have 25 questions piled up, I'll let you pick one, and that'll really have to be the last one.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so our last question comes from our advocate from Pakistan, Myra, and she asks, how, in your opinion, and this is obviously relevant to our motto as a whole, how can SAARC become more powerful as a bloc in the international sphere? And it is very broad, so feel free to narrow it down as you like.
Well, I think the answer is very blunt. I think it'll only happen when India-Pakistan bilateral problems are settled, because the main obstacle to SAARC blossoming has not been any of the other countries. It's been the fact that SAARC works through unanimity or consensus, and Pakistan objects to almost anything India proposes. And of course, India has been, ever since 26/11, the attacks on Mumbai on 26/11/2008, which killed 166 people, took place. There's been this great bitterness that Pakistan continues to incubate terrorists, send them across the border. And even though all the evidence for those who led and directed and financed and equipped and even guided these killers while they were on Indian soil, even though all the evidence has been provided, Pakistan has done nothing about apprehending them. And this has created a sense on India's part that we can't cooperate with Pakistan. Indeed, we can't even play cricket with them. So in these circumstances, I have to say that that's the big problem. SARC will not function when its two biggest members are not even able to talk to each other. During the very, very brief periods of mutual cooperation between our countries, we actually had SARC functioning well, and some of their areas of agreement looked very promising. But we really have to get over this fundamental problem. And I think that that is a far larger topic than we can discuss in the remaining time here. But I will say that without a serious effort being made to resolve differences between India and Pakistan so that they can actually cooperate across South Asian borders, I am afraid that strengthening SARC will be a pipe dream. It's no accident that the World Bank has written that the least integrated sub-region in the entire world is South Asia. That's a shameful record, and many of us have deplored it. But as a realist, I don't see that record being overcome without some really major changes on the core issue dividing us.
I think that's a very nice, pessimistic yet very hopeful sort of idea that you're leaving us with. Again, thank you so much for being here. You've left us with some ideas that I think are going to stay with us for a long time. And yeah, just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Vivan. Thank you, Ishan. Thank you, all of you who attended. All the best.
Thank you.
Take care.